Gentlemen of the court, there are times when I'm ashamed to be a member of the human race, and this is one such occasion.
While the term objectification is not typically applied to men, Stanley Kubrick's film Paths of Glory reminds us that throughout the ages, men too have often been no less objectified than women. Perhaps not in terms of their physical appearance or in terms of being sexually exploited, but in terms of their very lives, being used as pawns in the wars of the powerful. Set during World War I, Paths of Glory tells the story of a regiment of French soldiers that is ordered to attack a fortified German position, which they are not equipped to take, which means that it's basically a suicide mission. When it becomes apparent that the attack is doomed to failure, many of the men remain in the trenches instead of continuing the attack and meeting certain death. Thus, the attack is ultimately a huge disaster. But instead of accepting responsibility for ordering an attack that was doomed to fail from the start, the officers in charge shift responsibility and blame the soldiers who remained in the trenches for the failure. The commanding officer, General Miraut, wants to have 100 of these men court-martialed and executed for cowardice in order to cover for his own failure. But the officer who actually leads the men in the trenches, a man named Colonel Dax, tries to dissuade this, and the upper brass compromise the number down to just 3 men who must stand trial as an example for the other soldiers. Colonel Dax, who was a criminal defense lawyer before the war began, volunteers to defend these men. As the moral conscience of this film, Dax has every intention of saving these men, arguing that these men should not be killed, either for individual cowardice or for the actions of the whole regiment. Unfortunately, however, the trial is a farce. Indeed, it's not even really a trial, as Colonel Dax is not able to make a real argument or admit proper evidence, and even if he could, the judges would not listen to him, because they've already made up their minds. They sentenced the 3 men to death, and those 3 men are subsequently executed in a series of scenes that still hold up as some of the most gut-wrenching scenes of all time, purely on the merits of the writing and the performances. Despite having a reputation for subtlety and hidden meanings, Stanley Kubrick was not above straightforwardly preaching a cause in a very blunt manner, especially in his early years as a filmmaker. And Paths of Glory is a classic example of a straightforward anti-war film. Kubrick is saying, look, war is bad. And not only that, but there is a fundamental flaw in the kind of military hierarchy that existed in France during World War I. A hierarchy that kind of gave special privileges to officers and treated foot soldiers with contempt. It was easy to see that this film is, on the surface, about treating human beings as commodities, using them as means to an end, and that Kubrick was accusing certain governments of this very crime. But even at this early stage, as Kubrick seems to look us in the eyes with his dialogue, directly calling out a problem, we can begin to see the layers, the metaphors, the symbols, and subtlety that would characterize Kubrick's later films, though in this film he won't let it go over our heads. Throughout Paths of Glory, a film that really only has 1 female role, there runs beneath the surface a current of sexual illusions which crop up in seemingly out-of-place situations. For example, the idea of impregnating the anthill.
Not something we can grab and run away with, but certainly pregnable.
Sounds kind of odd, though, doesn't it?
Why?
Well, like something to do with giving birth.
Oh, yes, quite. You're right on your toes this morning, Colonel.
This is certainly not a romantic decision to have a child between 2 people who love each other, but in this case it is very clearly and literally an assault. And complementing this idea of giving birth, there is an unsettling through line of childishness, where the French officers treat their foot soldiers like children or babies.
Now out of it, soldier! Sergeant, I want you to arrange for the immediate transfer of this baby out of my regiment.
Well, you see, Colonel, troops are like children. Just as a child wants his father to be firm, troops crave discipline.
I see.
And one way to maintain discipline is to shoot a man now and then.
Rather than being regarded with love, the troops are looked down upon, often with disdain, disgust, or shame as stereotypical illegitimate children. In contrast to the sexual illusions used by the officers, the regular soldiers are marked by a kind of impotence. One of the men who is condemned to die says, in what seems to be a completely random line, that he hasn't had a sexual thought since the court-martial.
It just occurred to me, funny thing, I haven't had one sexual thought since the court-martial. It's pretty extraordinary, isn't it?
This line could be interpreted in a couple of ways. Insofar as sexuality is good, it's a sign that the mere fact of condemning him to death, especially for no good reason, has already robbed him of his manhood or humanity, since it is only human to have sexual thoughts. On the other hand, insofar as sexual thoughts can be bad, objectifying perverse things, it's a sign that his impending death and his dread of it has stopped him from viewing other humans as objects to fulfill his personal desire and use for his pleasure. This is a topic that Kubrick explores in his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, exploring sexual thoughts as they exist in the mind, in fantasies, and in dreams, versus how it exists and should exist in real life. In this scene in Paths of Glory, I can't help but see a kind of Kantian experiment to put yourself in someone else's shoes, or in this case, these soldiers are being forced into these shoes. If you find yourself being treated like an object, and you experience what it's like, you'll be disgusted at the thought of doing it to someone else. Maybe you'll even find yourself unable to think that way, if your own trauma is sufficiently severe. This is the connection which I see between this moment and the end of the film, with the soldiers in the final scene who go through a similar transformation. They cease having sexual thoughts as the woman in front of them sings about a soldier whose loved one has died. Though she is a German, she ceases to be either an enemy or an object to be used for their pleasure, their entertainment, or exploited, which is what the German anthill was for General Miro in the beginning, the German position that he wanted to impregnate. At the end of the film, though, this woman becomes a simple human being and a source of beauty in an ugly world, perhaps reminding the men with her song that many of them, like the 3 men who were executed, will meet a similar fate.
Many of us will be joining you before this war's over.
I don't care. I don't want to die. Please save me, Sergeant.
I can't save you. No one can now.
The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. The brutalities of war can rob men of their humanity, just as corrupt leadership does. And there's a sense here in which we discover what our humanity is, in its beauty and dignity, most powerfully when we are threatened with losing it. That's the two-edged sword of this film. It's a sword that violates human nature, not just by piercing the flesh, killing, throwing lives away, but it pierces the soul by nullifying human will. The military itself is obviously a structured organization based on rules and following orders, whether one wants to or not. But when it's done properly, not only should there be room for objections and appeals, but good leaders prioritize their followers.
With all respect, sir, you have no right to order me to shoot down my own men unless you are willing to take full and undivided responsibility for it.
Captain Russo, are you going to obey my order?
I must have a written order before I can execute such a command, sir.
I can't help but think of Colonel Ethan Allen and his narrative of the capture of Fort Ticonderoga during the American Revolution. In a moment of quick thinking, he realized that he had to attack this fort before the sun rose with only 83 men, and he couldn't wait for reinforcements, so he had to attack right now. And so he made this speech to those 83 men saying, "Friends and fellow soldiers, you have for a number of years past been a scourge and terror to arbitrary power. Your valor has been famed abroad and acknowledged, as appears by the advice and orders to me from the General Assembly of Connecticut, to surprise and take the garrison now before us. I now propose to advance before you and in person conduct you through the wicket gate. For we must this morning either quit our pretensions to valor or possess ourselves of this fortress in a few minutes. And inasmuch as it is a desperate attempt, which none but the bravest of men dare undertake, I do not urge it on any contrary to his will. You that will undertake voluntarily, poise your firelocks. And of course they did rush in, take the fort by surprise, and win the day. I don't know how accurate that speech is that Colonel Allen made, and maybe no one does, but darn it if it isn't pretty inspiring. In Paths of Glory, by stark contrast, it is characteristic of the officers to think of the men as animals.
Well, they never learn, it seems. They get in a tight spot under heavy fire, gang up every time. Herd instinct, I suppose, kind of a lower animal sort of thing.
Or kind of a human sort of thing, it seems to me. Or don't you make a distinction between the two, Major?
And the men themselves realize that by being made helpless, robbed of choice, they are basically animals. Everything that distinguishes them from cockroaches is made void.
See that cockroach? Tomorrow morning we'll be dead and it'll be alive. It'll have more contact with my wife and child than I will. I'll be nothing and it'll be alive.
Now you got the edge on him.
It's Colonel Dax who constantly maintains that the men are not animals, but humans. The way they respond to threats on their lives, like that from artillery barrages, is to huddle together, to get closer, not farther apart. And we might be reminded of this in the final scene, as we see these men crowded together in a cafe. And though it would be difficult to get a head count on every man there, we might also be reminded of the 97 men whom Colonel Dax was able to save from the court-martial, because he treated them as humans. And he treated them as humans partly because he was huddled close with them in the trenches and on the battlefield. These men and their leader, Colonel Dax, are far more human than their inhumane officers. And while at first they do seem rowdy and animalistic, they are dignified into their humanity by the beauty of song. As they join, they come together in the act of singing about enduring love in the face of death and loss. They now interpret themselves as who they really are, like the prodigal son who came to his senses and turned away from the pig slop which he'd been eating. The soldiers turn away from objectification and into selfhood. Here, if nowhere else, they become ends in themselves, rather than a means to some other end. Here, at least, Dax does not need to be ashamed of the human race. And as he walks away from the camera, maybe we can take solace in the hope that he goes out to continue fighting for the dignity of ordinary men. We can hope that not every situation is as hopeless as this one. If 3 men had to die unjustly, at least one bad man is kind of punished, because one good man chose to speak the truth. If another bad man continues in power, then so does at least one good man, which is the most that any realist can ask for on this side of eternity. Kirk Douglas would go on to make another film that had somewhat similar themes to Paths of Glory. Spartacus would be a film about revolt, a revolt that is ultimately fruitless. Slaves who fight for their freedom but are betrayed, ending up trapped with their backs against the wall, and ultimately executed. While Kubrick wasn't part of the film when they began shooting it, Douglas would replace the initial director with Kubrick, and one wonders if Kubrick wasn't attracted by the similarity of themes as well. Even so, Spartacus does not really feel like a Kubrick film, and I think that is largely because Kubrick often did not have complete creative control. He often didn't get his way on set. Thus, these themes of helplessness in front of the camera would cast a shadow behind the camera, as Kubrick found himself dealing with helplessness in a stifling studio system. His experience on Spartacus would ensure that he would never again work on a film on which he did not have final say and full creative control. It's as if the films up to this point had been a prelude, and the saga of Kubrick the Determinist was just beginning.